Hello, my name is John Massey. Today we're going to talk about sweet potatoes. Specifically, I want to talk about how to use sweet potatoes creatively so that you don't have to eat a bunch of baked sweet potatoes anytime you have a large harvest. So we have about 1,500 pounds of sweet potatoes in our garden beds, and I can't force our staff to eat baked sweet potatoes every day. So I'm going to show you how I work sweet potatoes into the menu every week in ways that are less obtrusive than just baking a sweet potato and putting it on their plate. If you followed us before, you'll know that we've already done a sweet potato gnocchi recipe. That is right here. So we are going to go ahead and continue with sweet potatoes. I'm going to show you 3 different ways that I like to use them. All right, so first things first, we need to get these peeled and washed. So unlike store-bought sweet potatoes, you can see our sweet potatoes are 1, a little dirtier, but 2, have all these little pock marks and holes in them. That is something called a sweet potato weevil. We have, that as a pest in our garden beds. And rather than spraying for them at the beginning of the season, we actually prefer to just go ahead and deal with it at the end of the season so that we get a nice sweet potato that's never been touched by any sprays, pesticides, herbicides, etc., etc. So to go ahead and peel these, you can use a peeler. Because we have such big divots though, I just like to use a knife. And I cut off both ends, and you can see on this end, this was very weevily, so we have to go ahead and take some of that off until there aren't any weevil holes anymore. And all these scraps are just going to go to our pigs, so they're not going to go to waste, but you can see I took out most of those. So we can go ahead, and I just like to sit it on the cabinet and run my knife vertically down until it's all peeled. Okay, so you get something like this. I just put it in a bowl of water until it's ready to go. All right, so now that we've gotten these cut, we want to go ahead and get them rinsed. So I do have them in a bowl of water here, but we're going to go ahead and drain them and make sure they're nice and clean before we start cooking them, because nobody wants to eat a dirty potato. All right, so now that we've got those nice and rinsed off, we're going to go ahead and cut these into little chunks so we can go ahead and cook them as quickly as possible. So what I like to do is take them vertically and chop them in half. And cube them up into about 1-inch chunks. We're going to be boiling them to make our sweet potato puree. So the smaller they are, the quicker they're going to cook, and the less time we have to wait for our stuff to be cooked and ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these up, and then we'll be good to go. So now that we've got these cut up, I'm going to go ahead and put them in our water. I already had a pot of water boiling, so this is going to take no time at all. The way I would suggest to do it is to take your cutting board right next to your thing and just slowly toss them in. You can also just toss them in with your hands. This just goes quicker for me. And these are going to boil for about 15 or so minutes until they can be pierced easily with a fork. All right, so our sweet potatoes have been going for about 15 minutes, so it's time to go ahead and test them. They should pierce without any resistance with a fork, and that is exactly what they're doing. So they're good to go. So we're going to go ahead and drain these, and then we'll mash them up, and they'll be another ingredient for us for the rest of our time. So we're just going to go ahead and mash these up, get them really nice. You want them to have the least amount of chunks you can, something like that. So the first one we're going to start with is bread. So when you prep bread, first thing you need to do is check your yeast to make sure it's still alive. We're going to do just a small amount of bread, so I'm going to do 2 cups of flour. So for every 2 to 3 cups of flour for bread, you want about a tablespoon of yeast, or 1 packet if you decide to grab a packet of yeast. So I'll go ahead, and this water is warm. It's at about 110 degrees. A good way to test that is if you can stick your pinky in it and it doesn't hurt, but it's still very warm, then that's kind of where you want to be at. So we'll do a tablespoon of yeast, and then I'm going to do about 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar. That's just going to help feed our yeast and get it to start producing carbon dioxide for us for our rise. So this isn't going to make the bread super sweet or anything. This is just going to feed our yeast. And then grab your smallest whisk, tiny whisk, of course, and get that all incorporated together. We can set this aside, so in about 10 minutes we'll see that there's going to be a pretty thick layer of bubbles on top of this. All right, so to your bowl, we're going to add 2 cups of flour, whatever flour you have on hand. I'm going to do 2 cups of all-purpose for this. I do have whole wheat flour on hand, but I don't have it open. So we'll do about 2 cups of flour. It doesn't have to be perfect because for bread, we're going to add flour later when we start to knead it. And then to that, we'll add about a teaspoon or so of salt. This is going to allow us to have a more buttery, rich flavor without actually having butter. We'll do probably about a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon. This is sweet potato bread, so we should probably spice it accordingly. And the same goes with about a 1/4 teaspoon of ground ginger. Then we will mix that thoroughly with our tiny whisk. It doesn't actually have to be a tiny whisk anymore, but we already made it dirty, so we might as well not make too many other things dirty for this. And then what you want to do, and you might grab a spoon for this as well other than a whisk, is once you've got it nice and mixed up, make a well in the center to receive all your wet ingredients. All right, so to that flour mixture, we're going to add somewhere between a 3/4 cup and a full cup of our sweet potato mixture. This has been boiled, so I would consider it more of a wet ingredient than a dry ingredient. It does have some water and moisture in it that the flour is going to need to take out. We're going to add 1 egg. This is going to fortify our dough, give it a lot of nice vitamins and minerals. Just because we want to keep playing on that sweet potato angle, we're going to add just a touch, like an 1/8 of a teaspoon of vanilla, and maybe a full teaspoon of molasses. This is going to really bring out that brown sugar taste and adds just some notes of like your Thanksgiving sweet potato casserole, even though these are going to be more like a bread roll. And then finally, we're going to add probably a full tablespoon, maybe even 2, of our olive oil or your fat of choice without too many worries. But we'll just go ahead and add a couple tablespoons of that in there. And then our yeast mixture, as you can see, has bubbled up really nicely. So it's very happy in here. So we're going to move it in here. And that's going to be the base of our bread. So grab your mixing implement of choice. I really like using this. This is a Dutch dough hook. It's basically the dough hook attachment on your mixer, but you don't have to have it attached to a mixer. We're going to mix that really thoroughly. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm using the center of the bowl, just scraping in a little bit of flour at a time to bring this from just really, really wet into a very wet bread dough. And as you can see, I need to add more flour. We want this to be more supple than anything else, but it's easier to add more flour to your bread dough than it is to try to add more water or take away flour from your bread dough. You can always add more, but it's a lot harder to move it from dry to wet if you have the option. So we're going to probably end up adding another cup of flour to this over the course of this process of mixing, and then in the process of kneading it, we'll end up probably adding another cup of flour. So the grand total will be 3 cups divided. So you want it to get to somewhere like this where you can touch it and it's not going to stick to your fingers. And then we will flour our work surface, and we're going to start building gluten into this dough. So for those of you who made bread before, this is going to be a very standard kneading process. I'm not trying to build a super high gluten dough, but I'm also not trying to avoid gluten. So I'll probably knead this on the table for 5-6 minutes until I have a nice supple ball of dough forming and it's not super sticky. So as you can see, as I'm kneading, I'm picking up bits of flour whenever it starts to get too sticky for my taste. And then I'm just continuing to work that flour into the middle of the dough so that it's all uniformly the same texture. So as you can see, our ball of dough has transformed over the course of the last 5-10 minutes of me beating it to death on this table. So this is going to go back in our bowl that we used for mixing. I don't like dirtying another bowl for this. I'm gonna add a bit of olive oil to the side so it doesn't stick. And this is going to rest for the next hour or so in our bowl. And it's gonna double in size over that time. All right, so it's been about an hour, so our bread has doubled in size. So it's time to go ahead and roll it out, get it into the oven, and be ready to go. So I prepped this just the same way as I prepped the muffin tins earlier, just a little bit of olive oil, just enough to get it to stop sticking. And our bread, as you remember, was about this big when we put them in, is now this big. So I'm going to turn these into dinner rolls. So I'm going to turn this out onto my table, and then I'm going to take a bench scraper. I'm going to cut this down into equal pieces. We're going to cut down into pieces. Basically, I'm just cutting it in half multiple times. Once I get it into a triangle, I'll roll it back up into a small ball and cut it down into quarters again and again and again until we have our desired number and size of our rolls. I'll probably end up at about 16 whenever I get to the size I want. All right, so this is about the size I want. Once you roll it out, you want it to be just a little bit bigger than a golf ball. Something about like this. And these will rise as we have them in the oven, so no need to worry. They'll all even out just a little bit and they'll get bigger. You want these spaced out about an inch from each other. You can have them closer if you want something more like a pull-away roll, kind of like a Hawaiian roll, but these are going to probably end up touching each other by the time they get into the oven. All right, so that's going to be that. So we're going to toss these in the oven, 350. We'll check on them in about 15 minutes, and then they'll probably need more time after that. All right, so our rolls are done. So as you can see, they did rise into each other a little bit, but they are a nice pull-away roll. No burns, no nothing, and nobody would ever tell that there's, half a pound of sweet potato in here.